Okay, so the last big push that we have to do for our soldering and electronics prep work is to prepare the board that has our Wi-Fi chip. That's this Huzzah breakout board here. Okay, our temperature and pressure and humidity sensor. That's this BME 280 component over here, and then everything else that's going to connect it all together and connect all the other wire inputs and outputs to everything else that we've already prepared. So what you see here is an unsoldered layout of everything we need to do. This follows the figure that I have in the manual that shows all the different positions and solder connections. So we're going to use that as our guide as we go along. And this shows you what it looks like before we solder everything. And the order in which we solder this all is fairly important. To do this last step, set aside plenty of time. Okay, it all depends on your skills and how long you want to do it to lay it all out. And you can certainly do it in steps. It doesn't have to all be done at once. The types of tools that you'll want to help you to do this is you'll need something to grip the components with. Okay, so this is a smooth edge in here. This won't cut anything. You want something that will cut through wire fairly easily. Okay, so something like this. Okay, so this is a sharp edge in there. You may need something to trim if you have any wire that you want to trim to prepare for. Okay, so that'll be helpful for that. And then I have my soldering iron, and then this is just some general wire. Okay, that we can cut to any length that we like. We're going to base this all off of this what Adafruit calls this Perma Proto half-size breadboard, and you can buy these breadboards in different sizes. And if it's the first time that you've worked with this sort of thing, you'll notice that on the board it's labeled with a negative and positive on the top strip, the same thing but in reverse order, negative and positive on the bottom. Okay, and then it's lettered along the rows and numbered along the columns over there. And this top half is basically the mirror image of the bottom half, and there's no electrical connection between the two unless you make a connection with a wire, which we'll do in a few places. If you turn the board over, you can see all the connections on the back. So this shows you where everything is connected electrically. Okay, so again, these top two and bottom two rows are sort of common grounding or power strips, if you like. Okay, so they are connected along the row to each other. So everything on the bottom is connected to everything else on the bottom row. Same thing for this row that's second from the bottom over here. Likewise in the top. So if you make a connection over here on the top left, you'll have that same signal or voltage or current running through everything else connected to everything else in that row. Okay. Whereas in these in these other holes, these are connected vertically. Okay, so each of these columns are connected to each other within each bottom part here, and then separately within each top part over here. So again, if you make a connection over here, I'm pointing with my thumb, then it'll connect everything below it. Okay, up until this break middle point here of the board. Okay, so we'll use that strategically to connect everything together so we have the right connections. Okay. So that's your basic introduction to this first part here. Okay, next, moving back to this unsoldered board that I've laid out, what you can do is you can pull off these this last components here. Okay, so we'll pull off the Huzzah board. Okay, if that's not yet soldered. Okay, and then the BME 280 temperature sensor, pressure and humidity sensor board. Okay, and then you can see everything else. There's a few wires and resistors that are revealed below it. Okay, so I've laid this out here so that these have to go in first before we then lay on the Huzzah board. Right, otherwise, because we only have so much space to work with this small board, and we're trying to keep the footprint of this overall electronics component of the weather station fairly small. Okay, so that's why in the manual I've color-coded some of the solder connections in the order in which I suggest that you solder them up, okay, because otherwise you won't be able to solder these particular ones that are hidden under the board after you've put down the board, okay, so make sure to follow that order. Okay, and we'll work through that here as I work throughout this video. It's also helpful if you lay this all out before you solder, because it gives you a sense of what all the lengths have to be, so that you make sure that you've got things arranged with the right size wire and resistor and so on. Okay, so if you buy these jumper wire kits that come with the jumper wires already made for you, as I'm working with mostly throughout here, then these different colors correspond to different lengths, okay, for any of these jumper wires. Okay, and those can be helpful to then get an idea of what you need in order to bridge all these gaps. Okay, so having taken apart my layout just to separate all the pieces, you'll see I have a few different types of components that we need to have ready to go here. Okay, so in no particular order, we're going to need 5 of these terminals. Okay, so these come separately. You can order these in batches of 5. You can maybe get 2 packages just in case something goes wrong and you need a replacement. Okay, we need our resistors. Okay, we have 3 different resistor values. We have 10 kilo ohm, 220 and 4.7 kilo ohm resistors. All right, and you can buy those singly or they can come in strips, and we'll size those depending on what we need for the lengths. We need our jumper wires. Okay, those are the ones I talked about already. We need our ESP8266. This is the Adafruit Feather Huzzah breakout board. Okay, and you can buy these in different configurations from Adafruit. You can have just the board itself, and then that'll ship with what are called these header pins. Okay, so header pins, these are these pins that connect the board, the circuit board itself to the breadboard. Okay, or you can buy it already soldered. You can buy it with these different configurations to make it easier to mount other components to it, depending on what you want. And they all differ by a few dollars, so whatever you want to do to make your life easy or make the project cheaper is fine. Here I bought the pre-soldered version just to make this faster to put together for this video. Okay, and then we have our BME 280 chip here. Okay, and this comes with the header pins separate, so these ones you do have to solder together yourself. And I'm not sure if it's standard, but this one comes with a set of header pins that is one more than you need. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have to solder these header pins to the connections here on the board that we'll need for later on. Okay, so whatever you do first, the order can differ. It doesn't make a big difference, but I generally suggest soldering the header pins to the boards depending on what you need, either for both the Huzzah and the BME 280, or just the BME 280 if you buy the Huzzah and it's pre-configured, pre-soldered arrangement. Okay, and when we look at the BME 280, you can see if we turn it around here. Okay, and you'll see this on the data sheets as well. Okay, but on the left here we have. Okay, so on the left we've got the input voltage connection. Okay, if you need any output voltage, which we don't for this project, but you connect that to there. We have ground. Okay, we have a serial clock connection. Okay, and we have a few other connections over here. We won't use all of these. Okay, so we'll need the input voltage, the ground, the serial clock. Okay, and then SDI is how we get the data out from the measurements here that it makes on board here. So all these different components do something different on the board, okay, but on here there is a pressure, a temperature, and humidity sensor. Okay, so it has its own operation, and then it sends out the signal via the SDI connection. Okay, so those are the ones that we need to solder up. You could solder all the pins if you wanted to. That might be more work than is necessary though. So I'll show you what it looks like if we just solder the ones that we need. Okay, and then before I do this, I will trim off the extra header pin that I don't need. Okay, and we'll leave all the rest on. Okay, so there are 7 holes here that we can connect to. This comes with 8 overall, so we'll trim off 1, and we'll have all 7 to at the very least support this this chip when we mount it to the breadboard as we solder it on later on. Okay, so there's 2 things you have to do. You need to solder the pins to the board, and then much later at the end of this process, we'll solder the bottom of the pin to the breadboard itself as one of our final steps once we put this all together. Okay. Okay, so using my wire cutter, I've trimmed off that extra header pin that I don't need. Okay, and then I'm ready to solder the board to the top of these pins here. So you have a short side on top, a longer side on bottom, as I'm holding it now. And the way that's easiest to do this is to take your breadboard, okay, or if you have any sort of circuit board, you can just put it in any of these open holes. And what we're going to do now is we're then going to turn this around, okay, because this is the configuration that we eventually are going to use it in our layout, okay. And we're just going to rest it in these in the short end of the header pins that are sticking up. Okay, so I've got that there, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to solder just the four that I need to solder. Okay, so I'm going to solder my voltage in, my ground, the SCK pin, and the SDI pin. Okay, I'm going to solder to the tops of what we see these little pins sticking out here. Okay, so I'll show you the result of that once I've done that soldering job. Okay, and that's the result of those four solder joints that I just made. Okay, like I said, we have the four that we're going to do, and remember we're only doing it through the top here. So at this point, the rest of the header pins for the bottom part, which will eventually solder to the breadboard, are not yet soldered. Okay, so it's only that top shorter part. Okay, and this black here, this black plastic strip, that's just a standoff. Okay, so it doesn't conduct any electricity, and it just raises this little board above the breadboard to a certain height to give some clearance underneath. Okay, so that's that step done.